On today's special edition of Ask the First Selectman, John Zagrodzky, our first selectman, is going to talk to us a little bit about an important piece of legislation still awaiting review by the governor in Hartford. John, welcome to the program again.
Thank you, Jim. Happy to be here.
So, some of our viewers may have heard about HB 5002, the housing bill. Could you tell us a little bit about what that would mean, having passed the legislature and awaiting the governor's signature, what that would mean if it was signed into law, how it would affect Darien?
Uh, sure, and thanks for the question, Jim. Maybe I'll just back up and give kind of 30 seconds of context about why we're even having this discussion. So, Connecticut faces a housing crisis like many states and municipalities around the country. And it's driven by the fact that we've seen significant inflation in housing prices across the country. And this is both in the value of homes if you want to purchase them and in the cost of just renting a place. I mean, anyone who's a parent of a young person in their 20s or 30s who's trying to get their child started in life, they're probably facing the same complaints, which is it's very difficult to find affordable housing really anywhere in Connecticut, certainly in the area where we live. And so for a long time, members of the legislature and others have been focused on trying to come up with some solutions for how they might approach this. And so a particular legislative solution that's been pushed by a number of groups has finally taken shape in the legislature this year, and it's the House Bill HB 5002, and it has a number of components to it. I won't go through all of them. It's worth reading if you have some time, but some of the major provisions of that bill include the following provisions. The first one is this idea of as of right conversion of commercial. What that means is someone owns a commercial building in a particular municipality would have the right to convert that to residential housing without the approval of zoning authorities in that town. Another provision is the allocation of what's called fair share housing. And what that means is that the bill assigns a quantity of affordable housing for each municipality that they're responsible for trying to zone or permit within their municipalities. And those are some pretty big numbers for towns like Darien, which I'll go into more in a minute in the letter that I sent to the governor. And there are some other provisions around the elimination of parking requirements for residential developments that have 24 or fewer units. In addition, there are provisions around lawsuit costs. So, for example, if someone comes in and decides they want to file suit against a town for an 830G case, if the town loses that, the town would be responsible for covering the legal costs of that plaintiff. So all of this is pretty complicated. I'll summarize by saying that this entire bill that was passed by the legislature is an attempt to address the housing crisis in Connecticut. It has a number of important provisions in it that we think as a town, and I speak on behalf of the entire Board of Selectmen, as well as multiple elected officials, both Democratic and Republican in Darien. We believe this is against the interests of our town. And I've come together to say that we recommend that the governor veto it. Just so you know, when the legislature closed its session on June 3rd this year, or June 4th, actually just a few days ago, they passed this legislation and sent it to the governor for his signature. And so he has until about June 20th to sign that bill or veto it. And there are lots of pressure groups on both sides of the issue that are trying to convince him one way or the other. But as I said, that as my point of view is for selectmen, I'm joined by a number of other officials, and we believe that the governor should veto this legislation.
And what can our viewers do if they're concerned about this?
Well, the first thing is I'm going to send to you, Jim, a copy of the letter that I sent to the governor a couple of hours ago that outlines specifically what the town of Darien's concerns are. What I would recommend is that anybody take a few minutes to read through that letter so you can see what those concerns are. And if you feel so motivated, there are ways to reach out to the governor's office. Of course, by email is probably the most efficient. So he'll get that as well as his staff, and they can review any concerns that you have. So if you want to add your voice to that, I would highly recommend it. There are two provisions in the bill that the town is particularly concerned about. The first one pertains to this notion of fair share allocation. So what they do in the bill is they've allocated to each town in Connecticut a certain number of affordable housing units that they would like each town to plan for in terms of zoning or permission so that someone in the future could build that housing. And for the town of Darien, that's 1,967 units. And just to put that in context, in the last 20 years, we've been able, including some housing that's planned, like at Thorndale Circle and the rest of the Corbin Drive developments, we will have built about 300 affordable housing units in town. And that's been a big stretch to do that because keep in mind, Darien is 98% developed. But this bill is going to require us to plan for 1,900 of those units. And we have to start off by at least doing plans for about 492 of those units. And so keep in mind that every time we've developed housing that's affordable, it's been part of a larger complex. In other words, it's not all just a single affordable housing development. And right now, what we require is developers to make 14% of the units they build affordable. And so if you think about that, even if we were just to plan for 492 units, if developers were going to stick with that 14% number, that would mean we'd have to build more than 3,500 units at a minimum in Darien to meet the affordable housing requirements in this bill. And that meant by comparison, Darien's a town of 21,000 people. We have about 7,000 residences. Imagine for a moment that we would go from 7,000 to 10,500 units just to satisfy the affordable housing requirements in this bill. There is no scenario where that is a reasonable objective for the town of Darien. It's simply not possible. And it just gets to this point to where, in my view, and the view of many other elected officials, Democrat and Republican, that this bill is simply infeasible for our town, and we need to start over with something different. Look, as I've said in the letter, which Jim is going to make available both on TV 79 and on social media, we're ready to sign up to try to help solve the affordable housing crisis in Connecticut. But this is flawed legislation that imposes targets on the town that, in my judgment, are not just infeasible, but irresponsible.
We'll put the contact information for the governor's office if anybody who is watching this wants to reach out and offer their opinions. And John, I want to thank you for joining us for another edition of Ask the First Selectman.